Hi, I'm Patricia Greenberg, and welcome to our show on all things aging well. Our guest today is Michael Fenster. He's a physician and the world's only interventional cardiologist with a culinary degree. He's the author of Food Shaman, The Art of Quantum Food, and The Fallacy of the Calorie. He's a leader in culinary medicine and all things eating well, is what I say. Hi, Chef Dr. Mike. So happy to have you here.
Hey, Patricia, so glad to be here finally.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks for being so
Yeah.
accommodating with the Montana weather outages and so forth.
That's okay. So, I mean, you're just living in what generally, I guess, is sunshine and fresh air, but every once in a while you'll have storms in the wintertime, right?
We do. That's to send folks back to California. So
Yeah,
we do that on purpose,
yeah,
so it doesn't
yeah.
get too crowded.
Stay nice and quiet. Absolutely. So, Dr. Chef Mike, how do you like to be addressed?
Chef Dr. Mike's fine. Mike,
Okay.
I've been called so many things we can't repeat on the air that
Yes.
any of those are good for me.
Good, good, good. So now your mission in life is to dispel food and health myths and advocate for a life of wellness grounded in evidence-based culinary medicine. Okay. So tell us about what you do and your team and everything that encompasses culinary medicine.
So part of what I do, and you mentioned that building that evidence base. So I teach culinary medicine here in Montana at the University of Montana, which is located at the western part of the state in Missoula, and actually have built that program from the ground up with the help of a very supportive dean. And I want to give him a shout out because he's retiring this year. So Professor Reed Humphrey, thanks so much, Reed. None of this would happen without your support. And through that, we've really built, as you said, evidence, because we need to have that scientific evidence. Having said that, and as a food person, I'm sure you appreciate, and as a science person, I can say one of the things about culinary medicine, which is really true with any science, particularly medicine, is that we must be comfortable with the unknown. So there are certain things that we can't know, that we don't know, but we know that they have effects. We may not know why. So very quickly, I'll give an example. My background in medicine is I'm an interventional cardiologist, and as a cardiologist, I can tell you that we've done research and we look at things like relationships that people have, spousal support, etc. And what we find is there is a clear, statistically significant benefit to being in a healthy relationship when it comes to not having a heart attack. If you do have a heart attack, recovering quicker, and then finally being less likely down the road to have more complications, repeat heart attacks, etc. How does that work? I have no idea. I know that I can't prescribe 12 units of happiness and love every day on my prescription pad. Some people might take the wrong idea with that. It can get me in
Yes,
trouble.
yes.
But certainly we know that it's extremely as effective as a lot of medications that I prescribe. So that kind of gives you an idea that when we look at evidence, we have to look at all these things. In terms of how we approach that application of culinary medicine, you mentioned a team, and so when I started in cardiology, interventional cardiology, more years ago than I care to remember. It's basically as an interventional cardiologist, I would butt heads with a cardiothoracic surgeon, and I'd say this person should get a stent, and they'd say no, this person should go to bypass surgery, and we'd kind of hash it out, and that was that. I think surgeons kind of came around because when confronted with, hey, I'm going to get a simple procedure, go home the next day, get a stent, or somebody's going to crack my sternum and splay my ribs open and work on my heart, I'll take the minimally invasive one first because we can always go back to surgery. And what that's really evolved to these days is what we call a heart team approach. So, at the nowadays, the interventional cardiologists like myself, we work with the surgeon. We look at the films together. We work with dietitians. We work with physician assistants. We work with exercise physiologists, nutritionists, etc. And so there's a whole team of us that work together, each bringing that little bit of a different perspective, the pros and the cons of different modalities of treatment to give and present to the patient the best option that we can come in on based on the evidence. And so with
Oh,
that,
let me ask you something just to throw in. So you have this team, and it's fabulous because it's not just one person making the decision. We see the care from all different perspectives. But how, I'm trying to figure out how to pose this. How far in are you going to bring in a team like that? You do it when the person's already just starting to have trouble, or that comes in when there's a real problem and the
the,
intervention needs to
yeah,
be
so
severe.
great question, Patricia. The heart team is really there once you show up in the hospital with a heart attack and you need some procedures and et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
we're talking about, wow, do you need a heart transplant? Do you need bypass surgery? Because there's so many blockages and their location. Is it something we can fix with a couple of stents? What are the pluses and minuses in there? So that's kind of after the fact. When it comes to culinary medicine team, that's something we want to apply before the fact. And so, I work and I've actually developed a company called BridgeMed.Health. And what we employ is that same sort of team approach. So it's someone like myself, because I'm nosy and get my hands in everything and work with all the folks that are involved. But we have for each host, we call it, because we basically imagine, as you will, if you were to come to us, we're coming to your dining room table. You're the host of that table, and at that table, you now have a dietitian who is geared and bringing a certain perspective. You have a professional chef who kind of knows those things that you like to eat. And we also bring in a behavior specialist, something we call a food relationship specialist, kind of along the therapist lines, because food involves emotion. And we're finding out that those things, right? I mentioned earlier, its impact on heart disease. Those things play into our health as well. And so much as human beings of our daily experience and food experience involves emotion and others that we really need to have that aspect if we're going to change behaviors in the long term.
So how receptive are people? Like this is an age-old question. I'm working aging, Mike. So I tell everybody how old I am and how long I've been doing this. I'm 63, and I've been at this a really long time. And I still find people so resistant.
Yeah,
It's so resistant to changing their life. And even if you're going to move the needle half an inch, people are very, very resistant to that.
I
So
think
it's so,
because we come at it with a health goal point,
mhm.
measurable sort of thing, that people are motivated. They love the idea. One, we work through insurance companies, so it doesn't cost them anything, which is always
That's
good.
the biggest thing, right?
That is a
Mhm,
big thing,
mhm.
right? And we could certainly understand it in this economy. Just buying food is so expensive these days when you can find it. So the ability, to get something like that, and you don't have to, sell your firstborn to do that is positive. And then really, we're often dealing with folks who have diabetes, pre-diabetes, complications of diabetes like heart disease, etc. So they are motivated by that. And it's once you experience something like that, and I'm sure you come across this in what you do, it is a bit of confronting your own mortality. As an interventional cardiologist, for your audience who doesn't know, I'm the guy that comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning when somebody's having a heart attack, and I meet them in a cardiac catheterization laboratory, and I'm putting that stent and stopping that heart attack. I am literally there, at what could be, they're literally on the door of death, right? We know heart disease is the number one killer in this country. And so people are usually very motivated after an
Yeah.
experience like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
But to have long-term success, they have to be motivated to change. Patricia, I've seen people that view us as a drive-through. Hey, I'm going to go out and smoke. I'm not going to exercise. I'm going to, eat the junk food at the drive-through. And when I have another heart attack, I'll come back in and you'll put another stent in, and I'm not worrying about it, doc. And my response is, yeah, if you get through the drive-through,
Right.
good chance you won't make it to the drive-through. So, to your point, you've got to be motivated. You got to want it, right? In
Right.
anything in life, you got to want it.
So I want to delve into culinary medicine and just sort of the guidelines. But before I do, Mike, why is heart disease the number one killer? Why is there so much heart disease? Do we have an answer for that?
Well, I think it really does go back to a lot of societal influences in our culture, in our society, the way we live, if I could kind of put it that way, along with what we eat. Now, a lot of people will say, Chef Dr. Mike, phooey, it's
Yeah.
genetics. My dad had a heart attack at 50. My brother had a heart attack at 50. I'm going to have a heart attack at 50, and I'm not worried about it. I'm going to do what the heck I want. But really, if we look, and this was an interesting slide I came across just the other day, uh, genetics are probably only responsible for about 11%
Mhm.
of that. If you go, don't take Chef Dr. Mike's word for it, just go to the American Heart Association, you'll find that 8 out of 10 early heart attacks are preventable. Now, let's just think about that for a second, Patricia. That means 80%, 8 out of 10 early heart attacks are preventable with things like diet, getting up and moving a little bit. Certainly, we know that stress, we live in a very stressful, particularly these days, society. And when we increase that stress, that has effects on our body. All of those play into it. So I think certainly diet is an identifiable corrective, potentially corrective variable in that equation. But I think it is a consequence, like a lot of things. If you look back over time, you didn't see the explosion of diabetes that we have now,
Right.
the obesity, all these inflammatory bowel diseases. My good friend is the premier inflammatory bowel surgeon at Johns Hopkins, and he and I were giving a lecture. We were on the podium together a couple of years ago. He's like, Mike, I love what you're doing because I can tell you that just in the 1950s, there was barely a mention of these, not because we didn't know about it, because it didn't have the prevalence that it does now. And now every other commercial is for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's and inflammatory. And these are consequences. How we live has a consequence.
I want to just get into the mechanics for a second because we always talk, and I have the real thing on my show today. If it's not a giant bottomless pit of discussion, but could you walk us through what a heart attack is?
Sure.
And I'm doing this to scare people. I'm going to be brutally honest. I really want people to know what I could tell you, but I want Dr. Mike to tell you what a heart attack is.
So first of all, as we say in the scientific medical community, it's what we call bad. Uh,
Mhm.
so it is a bad thing.
Mhm.
And it really starts, for the most part, many, many years before it manifests. And so it starts with the process of inflammation, kind of inflammation out of control.
Okay.
And it's that chronic, continuous, low-level inflammation. So I want you to imagine, your body has a thermostat like is in your house. And you're not just going to set it up to 120 degrees, right? You'd be sweating in an hour, but you're going to increase it by like a half a degree every day. And so that at some point down the line, wow, things have really gone to pot. And so that's what happens with this chronic inflammation. And this inflammation involves the inside of your arteries, your heart arteries. And so if you can imagine, the inside of your artery is kind of like any other pipe. And now imagine sort of the inside of that pipe just getting filled with debris and sort of the flotsam and jetsam of everyday life and what we eat. And what happens is that kind of builds like you would peel an onion in reverse, right? So there's sort of a layer there, and then that will actually break open a little bit. It becomes what we call unstable, what we call hot or unstable plaque, and that'll heal back over. And just as if you might cut yourself, give yourself a little scrape, you get a little scab, it stops bleeding, it heals over. And that's great, because at the end of the day, that scab goes away on your skin, might leave you with a little scar. Well, that happens on the inside of the artery. And so you might start with something like this, that then goes like the onion in reverse, where it gets
Mhm.
narrower and
Mhm.
narrower.
Mhm.
And then at some point that another one of those ruptures occur on the inside of that artery, and it just closes it off. And so now no blood is getting to the heart muscle. And without that blood reaching the heart muscle, heart tissue starts to die. And as far as we know, and certainly within our current, armamentarium, Once that heart muscle tissue dies, you don't get it back. It's sort of one and done.
Wow.
So it's not like another muscle. Like if you go to the gym and you break down your biceps, you make your biceps bigger, it grows back. Heart muscle isn't like that. And so it starts to form that area of a scar. And that means that the heart now is not as an efficient pump as when you started. And that leads to things like, if it doesn't kill you right away, which it can, it leads to things that people may be familiar with when we talk about heart failure.
Right.
You can't breathe, you don't have endurance, your feet swell, et cetera, et cetera. Also leads to the formation, because now you have a scar in your heart muscle tissue where you can develop bad heart rhythms. Some of those could be lethal. And so now we plant devices into people that are called defibrillators to help prevent that. So that is not something that is typically easy to get better once that happens. And so that's why it's so important to try to engage in prevention.
So, two questions. One is, at what point do you start looking at this? My father had heart disease, so I was having thallium stress tests when I was in my early 40s. I'm an old pro at all these heart tests, and I've been clear, thank goodness. Calcium carotid artery test, all that stuff, which is another show which will come back and we'll go over all those interventions. We'll spend some time on how that's done as well. But so, like, what is just the general guidelines? Get to a cardiologist at 40, get to a cardiologist at 50, or do you wait till something hurts or so you can't
Well,
breathe? What's
we
the recommendation?
Well, that's a great question, because if you asked me 10 years ago, I was sure I knew the answer.
Okay.
Which would have been, as you get older, this is a consequence of aging, and you got to go in and see your, not a bad idea. Once, as a male, once you hit 50s, women can generally wait a little bit longer due to protective effects of estrogen, but then postmenopausal, you'd want to follow up. But probably about a decade ago, that was thrown on its head. So we owe that to a tribe in Brazil called the Tismani, who we said we would screen, all our Western civilizations, and there's a prevalence of, as you were saying, hardening of the artery or the calcium depositions. Well, this tribe lives in the Amazon rainforest, and they're very active. They eat lots of, game meats and fish and plants, etc. And when we looked at their elders, their rate of coronary disease, asymptomatic coronary disease, through EBCT, or electron beam computed tomography, so measuring that calcium in there, was like 3%. So, and what we've found from studying these populations is it's not a genetic thing, right? Somebody in the audience is going, "Oh, but they just have really good genes." Well, what we find is when those people move to a big city, they get heart disease like the rest of us.
They take on
So
the lifestyle of wherever they live.
it's
Right.
exactly.
Mhm.
So if folks are familiar with Blue Zones, that was a big Netflix special, and Dan Buettner's work through National Geographic, what we find is functional, right? They've got their people have their capacities, they're active, these enclaves of people living so healthfully into their hundreds. Same sort of thing. There's not sort of a magic pill there. There's not a superfood that they take. What we find is that it really reflects lifestyle and community. Seem to be the strong, um, variables, in that equation.
Okay. And again, there's just so much on every one of these areas of this. So, how do we address chronic disease through food? I want to be clear because, again, every one of my guests I partner with in sharing the information, right? It's something we're doing together. You're going to share on what you know, and you're going to share on your social media, and I'm going to do the same. But together, we want to teach people small baby step, little easy things to do to not be overwhelmed and feel like, forget it. Why am I going to bother? Right. We want people to say every little bit helps, because that's what it is. My mantra is bite-sized solutions, just a little bit at a time. So how do we address chronic disease? Let's starting through food.
Well, I think the first thing is it's not too late, right?
Okay.
For people come and say, "Well, I've already had a heart attack, doc. Why to bother? I want to have a steak and I want to enjoy myself." And so, my response to that is, number one, you can have a steak, but you have to pick the right one.
Okay.
So it's not about living a life of deprivation and suffering. That I'm obviously a food guy. I'm a chef. I love to eat. I enjoy food. I enjoy all aspects of it, etc. So I think that is sort of the first thing. Is it's never too late. I can tell you that I've had patients who have been advanced in their years when they've changed, and they'll come back and they'll say, I'm feeling better than I did 20 years ago. I can tell you personally, I feel better because a lot of this was born of my personal health
Mhm.
challenges
Mhm.
and me looking at the data. I'm in way better shape and health and feel better than I did, 30 years ago, because of the lifestyle and a lot of the food I was eating. And I think a lot of it too, Patricia, you really hit on something, is just take it in steps. Part of enjoyment of food is doing it with the right attitude. And that means don't beat yourself up. I have people like, oh, I had a bag of potato chips. Fine.
Mhm.
Super Bowl's coming up. Super Bowl Sunday is sacred to me.
Yeah.
I'm going to have whatever I want in whatever form I want. And, it's once a day. That's not necessarily how I eat every day. Having
Right.
said that, it's all going to be good stuff because I like make my little slider buns are from scratch, etc. But if you want to indulge, have that piece of cake, with your grandchild on their birthday, and have that experience. It's very interesting. A friend of mine who is a family practice doc in California wrote a book because what she couldn't get her head around was these people who ate absolutely everything that sort of goes against common sense, and were healthy and healthy from a physiologic, laboratory test. And the people who were doing these uptight vegan protocols were a mess.
Right.
And it's like, but these people are happy in their lives, and these people are miserable all the time. And that counts for something as well. So, with that being said, I think there's a very simple step I give everybody, which is, hey, let's cut down the amount of ultra processed food you eat. And that's actually what our approach is with our bridge med solution. The average American, Patricia, eats about 70% of their diet is ultra processed.
Mhm.
There's plenty of room for improvement over a long time. And so we start cutting those things back, in small, manageable, as you said, to borrow from you, in small, manageable bites.
Right. Exactly. It's bite size. Mike, we talk about the buzzword is now superfoods. And do people overeat too much of the same thing when trying to follow that trend? So we know that blueberries are good for you, and we keep hearing they're going to sustain your memory and they're great for digestion and they're good for your heart. But do you need to eat 2 or 3 cups of blueberries every day? Like how do we manage that? I mean, because
Well,
I guess what I'm asking you is how do we together counter the insanity coming at you in the media, about every single morning, right? When you open up your social media, what do you see? Top 10 foods for heart health, 5 best foods for aging well, how to live to be 100, how to
yeah,
lose 50 pounds
I'd
in
say
30 days.
the first step to wisdom is to turn off the social media, right? And
Yeah.
what we teach, which would be a whole nother show, so I don't want to get too into the weeds, to borrow our culinary phrase.
Yeah.
Uh, but what we teach in culinary medicine is understanding food as information. And so that goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, Patricia, which is evidence-based, right? We have to get that right information. And so we have to do that with our food as well. And it comes down to sourcing. You get it as a food person, as an RD, as a chef, you get, right? It's automatic for you. But for most people, it's not for the average person. So we really work on helping people source. I hate this concept of superfoods because, like, anything that nature has made is pretty good. And walnuts, right? We always talk about, hey, those are great, blah blah blah. If my wife eats a walnut, she'll die because she has an anaphylactic walnut allergy.
Yeah.
So not such a great choice for her, right? So that walnut sends a bad information message to her body, as it were. So I think let's throw that out, and let's look at foods in a simpler way. In the vein of the information theory, we'll make a simple binary choice, which is, what information is about when we talk about, right? It's bits. It's a 0 or it's a 1. It's a yes or a no. So I try to tell folks to just look at food as, is it ultra processed or not? And it's that simple. And if it's ultra processed, is there something else you can pick? So the blueberry is great, right? Nature's blueberry is great. The, ultra processed smoothie blueberry, bottle of something with 6,000 things added to it that I have to pull out my organic chemistry textbook to decipher, that is not a good choice, even though it has blueberries.
Right.
And it may say, equivalent to 10 servings of blueberries. Meh. I'll quote my cat, meh. You
That's
know?
a very interesting way to describe that. That's exactly right. Is to look at the two alternatives. You're going to buy a bowl of blueberries, a container of blueberries, or take it in a shake. That's a really good way to describe that. What about supplements?
Well, supplements certainly can be very important. So I think we have to look at those on an individual case. And so, for example, I particularly before COVID, I traveled a great deal. I was on the road literally, I think probably 9 to 10 months a year. I was about 3 weeks a month I was on the road. And when I traveled, right, eating on the go is difficult. Just changing time zones can negatively affect your gut microbiome. So whenever I traveled, I always took, a good probiotic with me. So did I use a supplement? Yes. I used it for that specific reason when I was on the road. And I found it was, helpful and worthwhile. When I'm home more often, particularly now because I'm working on the new book, and so I'm in charge of my food on a daily basis. So I don't even take a probiotic supplement. So I think it depends, on your need, kind of where you are, etc. What I will say, my caveat is you can't supplement your way to good health. So you
Okay.
can't go through the drive-through 3 times a day, pop a few, probiotics, symbiotics, multivitamin, whatever it is you're going to take, and say, well, I made up for that by taking this because this is good, and they cancel each other out. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I vacillate with that too. People ask me about it. I say, well, a multi won't hurt you, but taking 20 different supplements or vitamins a day probably will. Or it's unnecessary. You're wasting your money.
Yeah, you're like, don't buy the omega-3, go get a salmon fillet.
Exactly.
Stop spending
Exactly.
$250 a month on some pure omega-3 and enjoy a good piece of salmon or,
Yeah, yeah,
whatever.
exactly. Excellent advice. Mike, we focus here on everything we talk about is on aging well, but of course we want to see, changes from childhood up. Something I pulled from your stuff. I'm just so enamored of everything you're doing. What you eat, who you eat with, when you eat are all part of the equation. I couldn't second that more. Eating alone is like, sitting is the new smoking, loneliness, just being by yourself, just having it to share with other people, cooking together, whether it's friends, whether it's a lover, a spouse, family members, or even going to visit your parents, go and have dinner and reminisce. I mean, these little tiny things. And if you're single, get out. I'm a huge advocate. I'm extroverted, so it's easy for me. I could get up and speak in front of 30,000 people, doesn't bother me a bit. And my husband marvels at that, that I can do that. But it's like, you never know where, a friend is going to come from or something, just getting out. But I really, really love that idea of who you eat with and making that a part of it rather than being, no one wants to go it alone.
Right.
And I
And
think that's going to come back to that evidence where you're talking about is why married people do better after surgeries of any kind, not just heart disease, just in general, having somebody there for you. And I've even heard unhappily married people live longer because there's somebody to yell at, I guess. But
maybe.
right. I mean, it's just having another and a dog. I'm a major dog person,
Yeah,
having a
me too.
dog. Yeah, getting out.
Yes, I think that when we look and what we examine in our study of culinary medicine is what we term the food experience. So certainly nutrients are one of those venues of information that we absorb. But if we look at the history of food, it is the history of human beings, right? We're social primates. That's where we come from. And we came together on the plains of the Serengeti, a couple 100,000 years ago, when Bob decided to grill a couple mastodon burgers and shared them with everybody else. And we sat there and we had food and we had stories, and that was the birth of humanity. And it's really paralleled us and the history of humans, and human civilization. So food is, and still does, suffice as a form of social currency, if you will. And so all those things that you highlighted are incredibly important. And if you do find yourself eating alone, that attitude is very important. And MFK Fisher wrote a great piece about this, the story of Lucellus. So for the audience, I'll give a bridge
Okay.
version. So Lucellus was this Roman senator who was uber rich, right? He's like the equivalent of one of our tech guys today,
Yeah.
could go gazillion dollars. And so he had a private chef, imagine that. And he said, okay, so chef, tonight, uh, what's for dinner? And the chef reeled off the menu, and he's like, that doesn't really sound all that great. And how come we're not having something better? And he said, well, sir, I saw tonight you were dining alone. And he said, well, we need to have this and this and this, because tonight Lucellus dines with Lucellus.
Yeah.
And so, if you're gonna have that moment, that is a time. One of the things that we cover, and when we talk about culinary medicine, are things called MBEs, mindfulness-based eating awareness techniques. A lot of great research in that area. But take that time and maybe that silence. Again, when I traveled and I was cooking in my hotel room, I turned the TV off, and I might do something simple for dinner, like just a French omelet
Yeah.
with a little salad on the side, but really taste those great eggs. And if you're enjoying a wine, kind of, there's a chance to really just stop, sip without distraction. So the flip side of that is, if you do find yourself alone, enjoy it, make the
I,
best of
I
it.
love that you're saying that, because the tendency, well, I'm by myself. I'll just eat a bag of chips in front of the
Yeah,
TV. Treat yourself like you would treat everybody else. Be the hostess with the mostest to yourself as well. Which
absolutely.
brings me, Mike, to like the little stuff. Like, I'm going to give you a little list.
Okay.
Coffee. We're hearing coffee's good for you. Coffee's bad. Caffeine. You shouldn't. Where are we at with coffee today?
I'm a big believer in coffee. The first article I wrote, I used to have a column for Psychology Today. I write for
Mhm.
foodismedicine.org now, but when I had my Psychology Today column, my first column was on coffee. So I'm a believer, it's a very natural thing. Now, having said that, when you add and forgive me, but we're like on podcast, so I can say stuff, right? Like chemical shitstorm that is a
Yep.
pumpkin
Yep.
spice latte,
Yeah. Oh,
from
yeah.
certain
Oh, yeah.
distributors.
Yes.
Yeah, probably not so much. So again, it goes back to what we were talking, Patricia. It's like, well, is this an ultra processed coffee, or is this a natural coffee? We have found, and we are continuing to find horrible things about some of these artificial sweeteners and the non-fat dairy things, etc. One of the things, my wife can't drink her coffee without a little bit. She's actually one of the bitter super tasters. So regular black coffee that I enjoy, super bitter. It's unpalatable to her,
Yeah. Okay.
but she'll put a little honey in it.
Okay.
So there's an
Mhm.
example of another something that's really good for you in small and reasonable amounts. So it's all about how we have that. But I think coffee in a natural form, yeah, I'm a big fan, and I gotta hope the heck it's good for me, because I drink a ton every
Yeah,
morning.
yeah. So what about the caffeine conundrum? The the coffee's good for us, but nowadays decaf has fallen out of favor. I think because of the way it was processed and formaldehyde. When we were
I
kids,
agree.
Sanko was decaffeinated coffee, and now it's taken on a whole new. So I buy organic, water processed decaf. I try to do so I have like my combination of regular and decaf. What about chocolate?
Again, chocolate, I think moderation is great. Tons of studies show the benefit to chocolate. I think where chocolate kind of maxes out is when people are eating chocolate in the form of dessert. So we'll have those added sugars, sweeteners in there. And so there becomes a point of diminishing returns when you're just consuming so much sugar because you're eating chocolate. So one of the ways, if you'd like to eat more chocolate, for example, is to use it in savory dishes, right?
Mhm.
You can find it in Oaxacan moles, for example. I'm going to give away one of my secrets. A secret in my chili is unsweetened cocoa. It adds an undertone of kind of that smoky earthiness to it. So remember, it's a back note. It's not the lead singer.
Right,
It's sort of
right.
the bass. It's a bass note. But certainly there. So if you can incorporate it into savory things, certainly the if you want to have a little bit of chocolate in the evening, folks do that, and those studies have borne out that it seems to be beneficial. But I do think you just have to, it's not so much the chocolate, I think it's the sugar and
Sugar.
things that it's combined with.
Right. It's because as kids, we ate all the Mars bars and the Hershey's and not to disparage them because they're heavenly. I can't walk past a bowl of Hershey's Kisses without taking one. It's just a childhood thing. But I do have the 72 to 85% cacao little chips with my almonds and walnuts at night as my dessert if I'm going to have any. Um, so now when we talk about everything, I want to also, what are the physical signals in your research and what you're doing now? Do you find, we hear eat till you're 80% full, don't stuff yourselves. What are some sort of like that intuitive feeling that people should start to look for when they're eating?
uh, all those things you said are spot on. So I advise people to listen to what you just said. One of the things that I would recommend is simply get away from mindless eating.
Mhm.
So, what you see, is people scrolling through their cell phones and just stuffing stuff in their gob nonstop. And so, if you're going to eat, enjoy it, enjoy the company, enjoy the food. If you find you're eating and you're not tasting it, stop, slow down. One of the great questions that I've gotten that I still don't know the answer to is is the Mediterranean diet really about the food, or is it about the way that people eat the food? And part for people who don't know, and this was actually a study done looking at the Mediterranean diet. I believe it was a sub study of the EPIC trial, which was a European trial, looked at about 500,000 people in different countries in Europe. And they looked at, well, what part of the Mediterranean diet, is beneficial? Is it the olive oil? Is it this or that? And they kind of, they did a fairly good job, I think, of sorting out what the percentages were. But why I mentioned that is to say that they found about, according to their estimates, 25% was the wine, drinking the wine.
Interesting.
And so I don't know if it's the wine per se, or the fact that when you're in Europe and you're sitting down and having a glass of wine, time slows down.
Yeah.
People are engaging across the table. They're in conversation. They're eating less. They're talking more. The meals last longer. To give you an idea, there was a study done of the French, who we know all love their food. And even in fast food, compared to Americans, the French spend 20 more minutes in McDonald's than the average American eating the same food,
Interesting.
just because of the cultural aspects of how they eat. So I don't know, is it the wine? Is it the things in the wine? Maybe. But, there is an argument to be made that the wine actually puts the brakes on, as she said, and slows down that whole process, because you're exactly right. It takes 20 plus minutes for your brain to start to signal, excuse me, your stomach to start to signal your brain that excuse me, that you've eaten, that you're full. And so if you can eat 48 ounces of beef, in 6 minutes, then you're not really regulating, sort of the intake to the need.
Well, this has always been my question because I'm on board with you across the board for sure. And I did a lot of research, and it turns out through Blue Zones and some of these other Mediterranean diet studies that Sardinia seems to have it down cold. The Sardinian people and the diet And the common thing, and I have to laugh because now I'm hearing that the whole, I think it's macrobiotic, that you can't eat nightshades, so eggplants are bad for you. Well, if eggplants were bad for you, everybody in the Mediterranean would be sick. And they,
Yeah.
they're one of
Tomatoes.
their staples. Same with in the Asian diet. Soy is bad for you. It makes your I wrote several books on soy, and I worked extensively researched. And again, that's another afternoon, but we can talk about that. Everybody in China and Japan and Indonesia would be dead. This is all, where is this coming from? But in looking at that, the wine that's produced, again, it's handmade produce, you're stomping your own feet, you're hanging out with your mother and your grandmother. And it's not that they don't care about education, about life, but they care more about their wellness and their togetherness with their family. And that to me is, so they're eating white bread, they're eating pasta, but they're also drinking wine. And apparently, the grapes of the Cananel wine out of Sardinia is supposed to be the number one, but it turns out they're Grenache. Just a FYI, everybody, PSA for all my listeners. It's actually the Grenache grapes. So anything from the south of France and lower will contain those high compounds that you're looking for in a wine that's very beneficial for you. So I say it kind of laughing. The other thing, Mike, is they take a nap in the afternoon. Now I'm at a point in my life, which I'm sure you are. Wouldn't you love your mother to tell you to go to bed right now? I'd love somebody to tell me to go take a nap in the afternoon. Go to sleep. I would love that. But that's another key piece is the rest and the siestas in the afternoon that they take. So we could talk about that all day, but we don't live there. We live here, and so we have to figure out how to incorporate that into our daily lives today. How much can we reverse at an older age? Is there a such thing as a reversing age? This
You know,
anti-aging bandwagon.
I honestly, I mean, I don't think so. Because at the end of the day, we're all going to die.
Mhm.
So we all age, we all die. That's going to happen. It's something that in the West we don't do a good job of talking about, and coming from a medical perspective, especially something like interventional cardiology, where I could, and I when I did a lot of work in the lab, what was disturbing was to see more and more younger and younger people
Mhm.
coming in with serious heart disease, and some of them dying,
And
in
you're saying
30s and
young,
40s.
30s and 40s. That's what I was
Oh
going to
yeah,
ask you.
yeah.
My
Well,
goodness. Wow.
they're predicting an epidemic, right? Because if we look, it's the younger generations that are consuming more and more of their diet in terms of ultra processed foods, less so. So one of the things that spurred me onto this was, I'd have an 80-year-old come in my office. We'd go to the cath lab, and yeah, there might be one blockage in a branch of an artery. I put a stent in, their heart functions normal. Then they're back out in the farm, growing their food, boiling down the lard, using the lard from their pigs to cook their green beans, and they're fine. And a 38-year-old, and this literally happened once, came to the emergency room, still had half of their drive-through hamburger that they had gotten, and had a massive heart attack and died.
Oh, that's
uh
so
you know
sad. Oh, that's so tragic.
yeah, and so I think part of this is the shift in dietary patterns, the shift, as you point out, though, very important, Patricia, in our societal patterns. I uh wrote an article recently for the foodismedicine.org column, and we talked about chrono disruptors. And so we live in a society where people can't go take that nap because they got to check that cell phone, and
Right.
it's called social jet lag, if you will, where people get into these weird periods of sleep, no sleep, no rest, stress, etc. And what we do know, and you and I were talking sort of before off air about the lymphatic system that seems to work when we're asleep, and is critical for draining the toxins from our brain. And so that would tell us that those periods that you're talking about, those periods of rest, that shutting down, are critical for long-term brain health. And so when we don't do that, it's just sort of another form of stress that we impose upon ourselves. But again, to your point, it's something that we can't take control of. So there's a positive there.
I think you just need to look out the window and the sun comes up and you can be productive during the day and sunlight. And as the sun goes down, you don't have to go to bed at 6 p.m., but it's a wind down. Is using nature as a way. If you really pay attention,
Wind
the
down.
world,
I see where you're going.
yeah, you
I
wind
wind
down. Yes,
down.
you wind down. You
Bottoms
wind
up.
down. But really, you pay attention to the world is telling you what you need if you just pay attention. Mike, we're hearing about, people, this again, weight conundrum. We're hearing about people having a bit of extra weight in older age is helpful. How does that play a role in cardiovascular health?
It plays a role, believe it or not, at all ages in terms of health. A colleague of mine, Chip Levy from Oxner Institute, wrote a great book, which was really a summation of all the different studies, something called the obesity paradox. So you can get the Audible book. I don't, Chip doesn't give me any money back. So
Okay, okay,
disclaimer.
okay, okay.
But great book. You can get the audio book. He goes through it, and it goes again what you and I were sort of talking about off air, which is the fact that in nature things are not simple straight lines. So often in medicine, what we see is what's called a J-shaped curve, which means if we go to one extreme, that's not good. There's kind of a sweet spot of moderation that gives us the most benefit, the most bang for our buck. And then, when we indulge ourselves too often, we pay the price. And that seems to be the same for weight. So this idea of the ideal body weight uh based on the BMI, which is a whole nother discussion because it's absolutely a horrible measure. Both the originator of the original BMI, which was called the Quetelet index, which was developed by Adolphus Quetelet, who was a Belgian polymath in the 19th century, and then popularized in the 70s by Ansel Keys, who gave us that term BMI. Both of them gave a very important caveat, which said this is great when looking at populations. Never ever apply it to an individual because of something called the ecological fallacy, which is a statistical. Folks, you can Google that if you want. But it basically says, what applies to large populations totally falls apart when you try to apply it to an individual. So if you, being the famous person you are, drive a Lamborghini, and me being the poor professor that I am, drives a Prius, statistically speaking, Lamborghini drivers are more likely to get a speeding ticket than Prius drivers. But when it comes to an individual, that kind of falls by the wayside. So it depends on how you drive. You're a careful, conscientious person. I might not be so much. And so in the end, I might get more speeding tickets than you, even though I drive a Prius. So those ideas of things like the BMI don't hold for the individual. And in fact, when we look at populations, what we found, and this was actually done, one of the largest studies that ever really looked at the effect of weight in total mortality outcomes, published in JAMA maybe about a decade ago, actually showed that the healthiest group is what's called moderately overweight. So that overweight, maybe into mildly obese category. People who were ideal body weight in terms of BMI now had the same risk as people who were obese, what we call grade 1 obesity. Some of this also has to do, as we mentioned, with the flaws with BMI, because muscle weighs more than fat. So people who are very muscular can actually be obese, but they're in great shape. Likewise,
That's
people
my
with slight
question. Like
frames.
a bodybuilder who weighs 300, because and the women are starting to become huge in bodybuilding. I follow bodybuilding. I love the sport of it. I love the sculpting of it. And I look at the men, and I was reading this article recently that a guy who's, weighing 330 pounds and getting into his 50s has the same risk of someone who's morbidly obese.
Yeah, you could look at LeBron James, who plays in the NBA. I think we
Mhm.
can all safely say he's a finely tuned
Sure,
athlete,
sure.
right? And I forget exactly when they did this, but they said given his height, his weight, he's obese.
Yeah,
But it was all muscle with LeBron, right?
right.
And that happened. You seen Rambo,
Yep,
Sylvester Stallone, short guy, but he was ripped as Rambo, morbidly obese given his height and his weight.
right, right.
And again, that's just another reason that BMI is not a great measure and not something I put a lot of stock into. And certainly it seems for various reasons that nature actually prefers us to have a little bit more central type obesity as we get older. You will lose subcutaneous fat,
Mhm.
which is why the skin thins as we get older. What we really want to avoid too, people talk obesity, what really seems to be correlated potentially more with where that fat is, because it's a different type of fat than somebody who's sort of just kind of well-rounded. Some of that is genetics and ethnicities. As I mentioned, African Americans tend to be more carry more muscle. So they tend to be heavier. So they're often diagnosed as obese when they're not. On the other extreme, those of Asian descent tend to have slighter frames. So they can carry a lot of central obesity and not be obese by BMI measures, but be unhealthy
So
in
bottom
terms of
line is
body
when
fat.
someone comes in, you want to know their weight as a baseline.
Yeah,
And
you want to know where the
it's going to
starting
play
point
and
is.
role in treatment and dosing of medications and things like that, right? That still the standard?
Yeah, and what I would say is people come in and there's sort of that ideal body weight and mildly overweight and very mildly obese, and I kind of keep those together. What's clear in the data is that type 2 obesity, type 3 obesity, morbidly obese, a waist circumference, that's 42 centimeters, et cetera, those sorts of things. There's no study that says that's healthy.
Right.
And unfortunately, or fortunately, because it makes it easy, morbid obesity is the fastest growing portion of the U.S. population, and also in many other industrialized, countries. So it's not like we have to sit and quabble over, well, mildly obese, this, right? There's a lot of folks out there that are getting way too overweight. They're morbid type 2, 3 obesity. They need some direction.
Right, right. Dr. Mike, what is your best advice for, especially as we age, something that sets in as much as we want to play pickleball and be around our friends and, do all the right thing for aging, the right exercise, the sleeping. What's your best advice for approaching nutrition, like for anxiety and depression, and even maybe preventing dementia? Because I know they tend to go, there's some research now showing they go hand in hand. Is there foods that actually you can pull out of your diet to help with that?
Well, again, we go back to the ultra processed foods.
Yes.
Study came out a year or two ago, and I believe it was for every. Don't quote me because I'm reaching back, but I think it was like for every 10% reduction in ultra processed food, there was about a 20% reduction in dementia risk, things like Alzheimer's, etc. So we can get away from that. Certainly, I think how we enjoy food, particularly, as we get older, is important for our cognitive, function. So the dialogue, the exchange, that sort of involvement, actually, if you, again, as if we're alone, we find ourselves during the day engaging in those mindfulness-based eating awareness techniques.
Mhm.
Why are those important? Because exercises like those have been shown, looking at structural MRI and functional MRI as well, to help slow down the risk of developing age-related neurodegenerative conditions. They've also actually been shown, believe it or not, to correlate with a reduction in the rate of telomere lengthening. So telomeres, for those in the audience who don't know, the best way I can describe it is if you ever, and I always forget the name of what they're called, so tell me if you remember, but you get the little plastic things at the end of your shoelace, or on your tennis shoes or
Yeah, I don't know
whatever.
what they're called, but I know
Yeah, they
exactly
have a
what you're
name
talking
that I
about.
always
Yes.
forget.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But it keeps the ends of your shoelaces from fraying, right? So you can tie and untie your shoelaces if you don't have the slip-ons. Well, telomeres are basically serve that function at the end of your DNA. So the ends of the DNA don't become unraveled, and they shorten as we get older until eventually they kind of wear away, and we can measure the length of those telomeres. And so engaging in those in those types of eating behaviors, those types of mindfulness exercises, for example, has been shown to slow the rate of telomere shortening. In essence, we have two kinds of aging, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, Patricia, right? We have chronological aging, which is how many years you've been here, and physiologic aging. And telomeres are a measure of our physiologic aging, which is, why you could go back to that reunion, 20 years ago, and somebody, looks like they did, back in high school 20, 40 years ago, and somebody else looks like Methuselah.
Right.
And so that's physiologic aging. You're all chronologically the same, but as I like to say, like with a car, it's not just what year it made, it's the miles.
Yes.
So you can
Yeah.
think of physiologic aging as the miles.
Yeah. Mike, there's just so much here and we're getting at time. And we're going to have you back because I think there's just so much more to talk about here and so much
Thank
more
you,
to
Patricia.
elaborate on. And I always like to ask all my guests, what do you like about getting older?
I think that, well, one, I never grew up having what people might refer to as FU money. So
Okay.
I never sort of had that luxury. And I think that getting older sort of gives you that luxury without necessarily having money.
Right. Right.
Because you're like, I've only the road behind is longer than the road ahead.
Right.
So, at that point, you really begin to bring into focus those things that are important. And I can tell you, as an interventional cardiologist, I had the great fortune because people shared their lives and their life and death moments with me to carry that from a much younger age and appreciate it more. You What people say is true. You don't take stuff with you. Nobody ever begged me, for one more day of work, for $10 extra, for more likes on social media. What they cared about were those people that were close to them and those relationships, and that's what the Harvard study has told us, right? That at the end of the day, what correlates not only to the years you have, but the quality of your life lived is not the number of relationships, but the quality of
Holiday.
relationships in your life. And so I can tell you, what have I done? I've come off the road. I'm not
Okay.
spending, 10 months of my life, away from the people I love and that I want to share experiences with every day. And so I finally got it through my thick head that, hey, I better, enjoy and treasure those and the people whilst I
Absolutely.
can.
Absolutely.
So the best thing that I think that sometimes that's a wisdom that only comes with aging a little bit.
Absolutely. Dr. Michael Fenster, this has just been so enlightening and engaging and thoroughly enjoyed having you here. And for more information about Dr. Michael Fenster and his program, his books, and any events coming up, he can be reached at chefdrmike.com, SHEFDRMIKE, which we will also post when the show is aired. Thank you for listening to my show on all things aging well. And please subscribe to my channel for more engaging discussions on all things aging. For feedback or show topic ideas, please contact me at www.patriciagreenberg.com. Thank you all and have a good night.